In the blood-soaked soil of the American West, stories aren't just told, they're scarred into the land. This isn't a tale of gunslingers or gold rushes. It's the story of a woman with nothing left to lose, who stared into the eyes of a starving coyote pack to save a child who was not her own. Her name was Lyra McCloud, a farmer's widow in the unforgiving Nebraska Territory of 1876. What she did that day was an act of raw human courage. But it was the act that followed 2 days later that would become a legend, the day a river of painted warriors, 120 strong, surrounded her home, not for war, but for an answer. The silence was the worst part. It was a physical presence on the plains, a heavy blanket woven from dust distance and the memory of what was lost. For Lyra McCloud, the silence had a name, Angus. Her husband had been a man of noise. The hearty boom of his laugh, the rhythmic clang of his hammer on the anvil, the off-key hymns he'd sing while mending fences. Now the only sounds were the ones the land made the groaning complaint of the windmill, the whisper of wind through the tall grass and the lonesome cry of a hawk circling in the vast, indifferent blue sky. It had been a year since the cholera took him, a swift and merciless thief in the night. It had left Lyra in a world bleached of its color and sound. She was 34, but the prairie sun and her grief had etched lines around her eyes that belonged to a woman twice her age. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and cracked from working the claim alone. It was a hard scrabble life, clinging to the 160 acres of their homestead like a lone tree on a wind-swept bluff. Their nearest neighbor, Silas Croft, a man whose piety was matched only by his suspicion of anything beyond his own fence line, was 4 miles to the east. The nearest town, Cottonwood Creek, was a full day's ride west. She was an island in a sea of grass, and most days the solitude was a comfort. It was a space big enough to hold her grief. But some days, like today, it felt like a chaos. The sun of late August 1876 beat down with a particular ferocity. It was the kind of heat that made the air shimmer, blurring the line between earth and sky. Lyra was fixing a loose board on the porch, the rhythmic thump of her hammer, a poor substitute for the memory of Angus's work. Her own son Thomas, taken by a fever 3 years before Angus's passing, had loved to watch his father work. He would have been 8 this year. The thought came unbidden, a familiar ache in her chest. She paused, pressing the heel of her hand against her sternum, and looked out over the endless expanse. That's when she saw it. Not a sight at first, but a disturbance in the heat haze. A frantic knot of motion about a half-mile out near the dry creek bed. It was a flurry of tawny brown and grey fur, a rolling, tumbling mass. Coyotes. A pack. They were usually shy, opportunistic scavengers, but drought had made them bold, and starvation had made them desperate. Her first instinct was to go inside and bolt the door. That was the sensible thing to do. She had her Winchester, and the cabin was sturdy. But something held her gaze. At the center of the yipping, snarling maelstrom, there was something else. Something small and dark. At first she thought it was a calf that had wandered from some distant herd. But it was too small, too upright. Her blood ran cold. It was a child. Lyra didn't think. The part of her that was a sensible widow, a woman alone and vulnerable, was silenced by a more primal, powerful instinct, the part of her that was a mother. She dropped the hammer, its clatter on the wooden planks shockingly loud in the stillness, and ran back into the cabin. Her hands, slick with sweat, fumbled for the Winchester rifle resting on its pegs above the hearth. She checked the chamber loaded. She grabbed a handful of extra cartridges, stuffing them into the pocket of her worn cotton dress, and burst back out into the blinding sun. She didn't run like a woman in a dress should. She hitched up her skirts and ran like a wild thing, her worn leather boots kicking up puffs of ochre dust. The half-mile distance was an eternity. The air burned in her lungs. The yips and snarls of the coyotes grew louder, more frenzied. She could hear a high, thin wail now, a sound of pure terror that sliced through her heart. As she got closer, the scene resolved into horrifying clarity. The pack, maybe 8 or 9 of them, gaunt and mangy, were circling a small boy. He couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old. He was Cheyenne, judging by his dark, straight hair, his beaded moccasins, and the simple leather tunic he wore. He had a small fallen branch in his hand, and he was swinging it wildly, his face a mask of terror and defiance. One of the coyotes, bolder than the rest, lunged, and the boy screamed as its teeth tore at the leather of his leggings. Lyra didn't dare fire from a distance. The boy was too close to the animals. She kept running, screaming a raw, guttural cry that came from the depths of her soul. "Get away! Get away from him!" The coyotes, startled by this new, larger threat, hesitated. Their heads swiveled toward her, lips curled back from yellowed teeth, low growls rumbling in their chests. That was the opening she needed. She closed the final 50 yards, raised the Winchester to her shoulder, and fired. The crack of the rifle shot was like the wrath of God on the silent plains. The lead coyote, the one that had lunged at the boy, yelped and dropped, kicking in the dust. The others scattered, but hunger was a powerful master. They regrouped a short distance away, watching, waiting. Lyra didn't waste time reloading. She charged into their midst, using the heavy rifle like a club. She brought the solid walnut stock down with a sickening crunch on the head of another coyote that dared to stand its ground. It collapsed with a whimper. The rest of the pack, finally convinced this was a fight they could not win, broke and fled, melting back into the tall grass and the heat haze. Silence descended once more, broken only by Lyra's own ragged gasps for air and the boy's terrified whimpers. She stood there for a moment, chest heaving, the heavy rifle in her hands. 2 dead animals at her feet. The boy had collapsed to the ground, his small body trembling uncontrollably. Slowly, as if approaching a frightened colt, Lyra lowered the rifle and took a step toward him. He flinched, scrambling backward, his dark eyes wide with fear. He wasn't just afraid of the coyotes anymore. He was afraid of her, this pale, strange woman who had appeared out of nowhere with a thunder stick. "It's all right," she said, her voice soft, gentle. "I'm not going to hurt you." He, of course, didn't understand her words. He just stared at her, his whole body coiled like a spring. Lyra sank to her knees in the dusty grass, making herself smaller, less threatening. She laid the Winchester on the ground and held out her empty hands, palms up. "It's all right," she repeated. She saw the gash on his leg, a deep tear in the leather leggings where the coyote's teeth had found purchase. Blood was welling up, staining the buckskin dark red. He needed care. He couldn't stay out here. She pointed to his leg, then to herself, then motioned toward her cabin, a dark speck on the horizon. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. She knew this was a dangerous game. He was a Cheyenne boy. His people were not at open war with the settlers in this specific region. Not right now. But the tension was a constant humming wire. The massacre at the Washita was a recent memory, and the rumblings of war with the Sioux to the north were on every white man's lips. To be found with a Cheyenne child, it could be seen as a kindness, or it could be seen as a kidnapping, but looking at him so small and so utterly alone, none of that mattered. He was a child, bleeding and terrified. She reached out her hand slowly, not to touch him, but as an offering. He watched the hand for a long moment. Then his eyes, ancient and full of a sorrow she recognized, met hers. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Gently, carefully, Lyra scooped him up into her arms. He was lighter than a sack of flour, all sinew and bone. He stiffened at her touch, but didn't fight her. As she stood, cradling the boy, she retrieved her rifle. She looked back at the two dead coyotes, their bodies already drawing flies in the oppressive heat. Then she turned and began the long, slow walk back to the cabin, a Cheyenne boy in her arms, and a deep, gut-wrenching certainty that the silence of her life had just been broken for good. The quiet she had known was a peace of sorts. What was coming, she feared, would be anything but. The interior of the cabin was a refuge from the glaring sun, cool and smelling faintly of wood smoke, dried herbs, and lye soap. Lyra carried the boy directly to the rough-hewn table that Angus had built and gently set him down on its surface. For the first time, she could properly see him. His skin was the color of rich earth, and his black hair, cut straight across his brow, was matted with dust and sweat. His face was streaked with tears, but his eyes, dark and intelligent, watched her every move. He was a beautiful child, she thought, with a fierce, proud set to his small jaw that reminded her so much of her own Thomas. The boy winced as his leg jostled, and Lyra's attention snapped back to the injury. "All right, now let's see to this," she murmured, more to herself than to him. She moved with a practiced efficiency, honed by years of frontier life, where doctoring was as much a part of the daily routine as cooking or mending. She stoked the fire in the hearth and put a kettle on to boil. From a wooden chest, she retrieved clean linen strips, a jar of foul-smelling but effective comfrey salve, and a bottle of whiskey. The boy watched her, his body tense. When she approached with a wet cloth to clean the wound, he flinched violently, letting out a small cry. "Shh, shh," Lyra soothed, holding up her hands. "Easy now. Just cleaning it. Has to be done." She worked slowly, her movements deliberate. She showed him the cloth, dipped it in the warm water, and dabbed gently at her own arm first, then gestured to his leg. He seemed to understand. He gritted his teeth, his small hands clutching the edge of the table, but he allowed her to clean the blood and dirt from the 4 deep puncture wounds. The gash was ugly, but the bleeding was slowing. It didn't look like an artery had been hit, thank God. She uncorked the whiskey. The sharp scent filled the small room. The boy's eyes widened in alarm as she poured a small amount onto a fresh cloth. "This is going to sting," she warned him, knowing he wouldn't understand the words, but would soon understand the meaning. "It's for the sickness. Stings now so you don't get it sick later. Be brave." She met his gaze, holding it for a long moment, before she pressed the alcohol-soaked cloth to the wound. He cried out a sharp, piercing sound, and his whole body arched in pain. Tears streamed from his eyes, but he made no move to push her away. He endured it, his face contorted in a mask of silent agony. Lyra's heart broke for him. She worked quickly, her own eyes stinging with sympathetic tears, cleaning the wound with the fiery liquid before applying a thick layer of the cool green salve. Finally, she wrapped his calf snugly with the clean linen strips. When she was done, he lay back on the table exhausted and trembling, his breathing coming in shallow pants. Lyra poured a cup of water from the bucket and held it to his lips. He drank greedily, his eyes never leaving hers. There was a trust forming in that small space, a fragile bridge built across a chasm of language and culture. He was no longer just a Cheyenne boy. He had a face, a presence. He was real. She had saved him, and now she felt a fierce, terrifying protectiveness over him. As dusk began to settle, painting the prairie in hues of orange and purple, she moved him from the table to the small cot in the corner, Thomas's cot. She had never had the heart to dismantle it. She pulled a quilt over him, one her own mother had made. He was asleep almost instantly, his dark lashes stark against his flushed cheeks. Lyra sat in her rocking chair, the Winchester now resting across her lap, and watched him sleep. The questions she had pushed aside in the heat of the moment now came rushing in. Who was? Where were his people? A child this young would not be alone unless something terrible had happened. Had he wandered off from a hunting party? Or was it something worse, an attack? Sickness. Her mind raced through the possibilities, each one more frightening than the last. The Cheyenne were nomadic. His family could be 50 miles away by now, or they could be just over the next rise. If they found him here, in a white woman's cabin, what would they think? Would they see the clean bandage and the warm quilt? Or would they see a cage and her as the captor? A sharp knock on the door made her jump, her hand tightening on the rifle. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was too late for a casual visitor. "Lyra! You in there?" A man's voice called out. She relaxed slightly, but her hand stayed on the rifle. It was Silas Croft, her neighbor. "Just a moment, Silas," she called back, her voice tight. She rose quietly and stood the Winchester by the door before unlatching it. Silas stood on her porch, a lantern in one hand and a shotgun in the other. He was a gaunt, severe-looking man with a fringe of grey hair and pale, judgmental eyes. "Saw the smoke from your chimney," he said, his gaze sweeping past her into the cabin's interior. "Figured I'd check. Didn't hear you was expecting company." His eyes narrowed. "Heard a rifle shot earlier. Sounded like it came from your direction." "Coyote was getting bold," Lyra said, keeping her body framed in the doorway, trying to block his view of the cot. But Silas was not easily deterred. He craned his neck, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. They fell upon the small form under the quilt on Thomas's cot. A flicker of disbelief, then suspicion, then pure, unadulterated alarm crossed his face. "Good Lord in heaven, Lyra," he hissed, his voice a harsh whisper. "What have you done? Is that an Indian child? He was being attacked by coyotes, Silas. I couldn't just leave him," she said, her voice low and firm. "Attacked?" Silas scoffed, though he kept his voice down. "More likely he was bait. You know how they are. A trick. They'll send in a child who to make you soft, and the rest of the war party is waiting in the grass." "There was no war party," Lyra snapped. "Just a little boy and a pack of starving animals." Silas took a step back from her door, as if her compassion were a contagion. His eyes were wide with a fear she found infuriating. "That's a Cheyenne whelp, Lyra." "I know the look. Their main bands might be north, but there are scouting parties all over. If his people come looking for him here, they won't knock politely. They'll burn you out. They'll kill you. And then they'll come for me and mine." "He's a child," Lyra repeated, her voice trembling with a rage that surprised her. "What was I supposed to do? Let him be torn apart?" "You were supposed to be smart," Silas retorted. You were supposed to lock your door and save your own skin. This ain't your fight. This ain't your kin. You turn him out now before it's too late." "I will not," she said, the words as solid as rock. "He's hurt. I'll not send a bleeding child out into the night to die." Silas stared at her, his face a mixture of disgust and pity. "You're a fool, Lyra McCloud. A sentimental fool. Your grief for your own has made you blind. You've brought a hornet's nest to your hearth. When it stings, don't come crying to me." He backed away from the porch. "I'm riding to Cottonwood Creek at first light. I'm telling Sheriff Brody. Maybe he can talk some sense into you before we all have to pay the price for your foolish heart." He turned without another word and stalked off into the darkness, his lantern bobbing like a resentful firefly. Lyra closed the door and slid the heavy wooden bolt into place. The sound echoed in the sudden silence. She leaned her forehead against the cool wood, her body trembling. The threat from the Coyotes was over, but Silas had just made it terrifyingly clear that a new, more dangerous threat was just beginning. She had thought the cabin was a refuge, but Silas's words had turned its walls into a saw, trapping her inside with her decision. She looked over at the sleeping boy, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The storm wasn't just coming from the outside anymore. It was here inside these four walls, and she was standing right in the eye of it. She had one day, maybe two, before the world came crashing down on her. The first light of dawn found Lyra already awake. She hadn't slept. Every gust of wind, every creak of the cabin's timbers had sounded like the footfall of an approaching warrior or the cocking of a rifle. She had sat in the rocking chair all night, the Winchester, a cold, heavy weight on her lap, watching the boy. He had woken once in the night, feverish and crying out in a language she didn't understand. She had cooled his forehead with a damp cloth and spoken to him in low, soothing tones, the way she had with Thomas. He had eventually settled his small hand, gripping her finger, with surprising strength, before he drifted back to sleep. Now, with the sun rising, she knew she had to act. Silas's threat to fetch the sheriff was real. She could either wait for the law to come to her, or she could meet it head-on. More importantly, she needed supplies. The boy's fever was a bad sign. She needed quinine and perhaps better bandages than the linen strips she had. She made her decision. She would ride to Cottonwood Creek herself. The boy was still sleeping soundly. His breathing was even, the fever seemingly having broken with the dawn. Leaving him was a risk, but staying and waiting was a bigger one. She scribbled a hasty note, knowing full well Silas would be the only one to find it if something happened to her, and left it on the table gone to town. Back by sundown. She left a bucket of fresh water and a bowl of leftover stew beside the cot, in case he woke up hungry. After a final look at the sleeping child, she bolted the door from the outside and strode to the small paddock where her horse, a sturdy buckskin mare named Daisy, was waiting. The ride to Cottonwood Creek was one she had made 100 times, but today it felt different. The familiar landscape seemed menacing. Every rustle in the grass, every shadow cast by a lonely butte held a potential threat. She rode hard, pushing Daisy faster than she normally would, a sense of urgency propelling her forward. Silas would have had a head start, but his old nag was no match for Daisy's younger legs. Cottonwood Creek was less a town, and more a hopeful cluster of buildings, huddled along a muddy stream, a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a church, and the sheriff's office. As Lyra rode down the single dusty street, she felt the eyes of the townspeople on her. News like wildfire traveled fast on the plains. Silas had clearly already been here. Faces peered from windows. Men talking outside the saloon fell silent as she passed, their gazes hard. Mrs. Abernathy, the storekeeper's wife, who usually offered a kind word, pulled her children closer and hurried inside her home. The welcome mat of the small community had been pulled from under her feet. She was an outsider now, a pariah. She tied Daisy outside the general store and walked in the little bell above the door, announcing her arrival with a cheerful jingle that was jarringly at odds with the atmosphere inside. Mr. Abernathy was behind the counter, polishing a glass jar with a rag. He looked up, and his face, normally ruddy and welcoming, became a stony mask. "Lyra," he said, his voice flat. "Henry," she replied, trying to keep her own voice steady. "I need some things. Quinine, some rolled bandages, and a bit of jerky." Abernathy stopped polishing the jar and placed it deliberately on the counter. "Heard you took in a stray," he said, not looking at her. "I helped a child who was in trouble, Henry." "That's not what Silas Croft tells it," he muttered. "Says you've brought the devil's own get into your home. A Cheyenne. After what happened to the Miller family over on the Republican River last spring, people are spooked, Lyra. You can't blame them. The Miller family was hit by Kiowa raiders, not Cheyenne." She countered, her temper flaring. "And this is a little boy, not a raiding party." "They're all the same to folks around here," Abernathy said, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes were cold. "I can't sell you the quinine, Lyra. It's for sick folks in the town, not for that." Lyra stared at him, stunned. "Henry, we've known each other for 5 years. You and Angus stood up for each other against the railroad survey. And Angus would be turning in his grave if he knew you were sheltering one of them in his house on his son's own bed." Abernathy shot back. He gestured to the door. "I think you should go. You're not welcome here while you're courting trouble." Shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief, Lyra turned on her heel and walked out the little bell, mocking her with its cheerful sound. The door to the community had been slammed and bolted in her face. Her last hope was the sheriff. Sheriff Brody's office was a small clapboard building with a single barred window. Brody himself was a big man, broad-shouldered with a weathered face and tired eyes that had seen too much. He was sitting at his desk, whittling a piece of wood when she entered. He didn't look surprised to see her. "Silas paid me a visit this morning," he said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't stop whittling. Caused quite a stir. "Then you know why I'm here," Lyra said, standing before his desk. "Abernathy won't sell me medicine for the boy. He's got a fever." "The boy's a Cheyenne, Lyra," Brody said, finally looking up. His eyes weren't hostile like Abernathy's, but they were filled with a weary resignation. "What did you expect?" "I expect common decency. I expect a little Christian charity from the good people of this town, who fill the pews every Sunday." Brody sighed, setting his knife and piece of wood down on the desk. "Decency gets complicated out here. 2 months ago, a Cheyenne hunting party and some Pawnee scouts had a skirmish 20 miles north of here. Left 4 men dead. Last year, the army had that big dust-up with them down south. To these people," he gestured vaguely toward the street, "a Cheyenne is a Cheyenne. And right now, you're the woman who brought one into our backyard. So you're going to do nothing. You're the law. The law says you haven't broken any statutes. Not yet," Brody said, leaning forward. His voice dropped. "But I'm giving you advice now, not as the sheriff, but as a man who respected your husband. A storm's coming, Lyra. You can feel it on the wind. The armies pushing the Sioux and the Cheyenne into a corner up in the Black Hills. Sooner or later, that corner is going to explode, and the blast is going to be felt all the way down here. You need to get that boy out of your house. And take him where? She cried, her composure finally cracking. Leave him on the prairie. For all I know, his family is dead. Take him to Fort Hartsuff, Brody suggested. The army has scouts interpreters. They can find his people. It's the safest play for everyone. For you, for the boy, and for this town. The thought of turning the boy over to the uniformed soldiers, the very men his people were fighting, made Lyra's stomach turn. They wouldn't see a child. They'd see a pawn, a bargaining chip, or worse, a nuisance. No, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I can't do that. Sheriff Brody studied her face for a long moment, a flicker of something admiration, perhaps, or pity in his tired eyes. He shook his head slowly. You're as stubborn as Angus was. I hope to God it doesn't get you killed. He stood up and walked to a locked cabinet in the corner. He opened it, took out a small brown bottle, and slid it across the desk to her. It's quinine, he said gruffly. You didn't get it from me. I was never here. You were never here. Now get on your horse and ride straight home. Don't stop. Don't talk to anyone. And Lyra, bolt your door. Pray that his family doesn't find you, because if they do, this badge and this gun won't be worth a damn. Clutching the bottle of quinine, Lyra left the office. The ride home was even more fraught than the ride in. The sheriff's words echoed in her mind. A storm's coming. She wasn't just fighting the prejudice of her neighbors anymore. She was caught in the gears of a much larger, more dangerous machine. As she crested the last rise and saw her small cabin standing solitary against the setting sun, a wave of dread washed over her. It looked so small, so fragile. She spurred Daisy on, desperate to get back inside its flimsy walls. She pulled up, swung down from the saddle, and ran to the door. It was still bolted from the outside, just as she'd left it. A small measure of relief. She fumbled with the latch, her fingers clumsy with haste, and pushed the door open. I'm back, she called out. The cabin was silent. The stew was untouched. The boy was gone. The cot was empty. Panic seized her cold and sharp. She scanned the room, her eyes wild. Then she saw it. The back window, the one that looked out over the creek bed, was shattered. A small piece of torn buckskin from his tunic was snagged on a shard of broken glass. He hadn't just woken up and left. He had fled. The sun had bled out of the sky, leaving behind bruised purple clouds on the western horizon. A profound silence had fallen deeper and more menacing than the one Lyra had grown used to. It was the silence of anticipation, the held breath before a lightning strike. She stood in the middle of her cabin, the shattered window, a gaping wound in the wall. Her heart, a frantic drum against her ribs. He was gone. The boy had run. Had he been scared? Had he woken up alone in the strange house and panicked? Or had someone taken him? The thought sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. She grabbed the Winchester and ran outside, calling his name, a name she didn't even know. Boy, little boy, where are you? Her voice was swallowed by the immense, darkening landscape. Only the wind answered, whispering through the grass like 1,000 secrets. She circled the cabin, her eyes scanning the ground for tracks. She found them near the broken window, small moccasined footprints heading not east or west, but north toward the low, rolling hills that marked the edge of the Sandhills country. He was hurt, he had a fever, and he was heading into the wilderness alone as night fell. For a moment, she was paralyzed by indecision. Should she go after him? Or should she stay bar the door and heed Sheriff Brody's warning? But the image of the boy, small and feverish, stumbling through the darkness, was more than she could bear. He was her responsibility. She had pulled him from the jaws of the coyotes. She couldn't abandon him to the prairie now. She saddled Daisy again, her movements hurried and clumsy in the fading light. She strapped the Winchester to the saddle and tied a lantern to the horn. She was about to mount when she felt it. It wasn't a sound. It was a vibration. A low, rhythmic tremor in the ground, felt more through the soles of her boots than heard with her ears. It was a feeling she had never experienced, but one her instincts recognized immediately. Hoofbeats. Not one horse or a dozen, but many. An army of them. Her head snapped up her eyes, scanning the ridge to the north, the same direction the boy had fled. And then she saw them. They came over the crest of the hill, not as a group, but as a flood. A living river of painted flesh and feathered lances silhouetted against the last light of dusk. They weren't a scouting party. They were a war band. At first she thought there were 50. Then she realized her count was impossibly low. The line kept pouring over the ridge, spreading out, fanning across the prairie. 100. Then more. They moved with a terrifying, fluid silence, the only sound that low, thunderous drumming of unshod hooves on the dry earth. Fear, absolute and primal, rooted Lyra to the spot. This was the storm Brody had warned her about. This was the hornet's nest Silas had accused her of bringing to her door. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get on the horse and flee in the opposite direction. But her legs wouldn't obey. Where could she run that they couldn't follow? They formed a vast, perfect semicircle around her homestead, their line stretching from the creek bed on one side to the edge of her tilled cornfield on the other. 120 points of death, each one aimed directly at her heart. They stopped 100 yards out, and the world fell utterly silent again. In the twilight, she could see the details, the grim, determined faces painted for war, the glint of rifle barrels, the deadly tips of lances adorned with eagle feathers, the muscular sheen of their ponies. From the center of the line, one rider emerged. He rode forward slowly, his mount a magnificent black and white pinto that seemed to glide over the ground. The man himself was imposing a figure of raw power and authority. He wore a full eagle feather war bonnet that trailed down his back, and his chest was covered by a bone plate breastplate. His face in the gloaming looked as if it were carved from granite, and his eyes, even at this distance, seemed to hold the cold fire of a winter star. This was their leader, the war chief. Lyra's breath hitched. Her hand strayed to the shotgun she had left leaning against the cabin wall. It was a pathetic gesture of defiance against such an overwhelming force. Bringing it to her shoulder would be suicide, but doing nothing felt like surrender. Her mind raced. Where was the boy? Had they found him? Was he alive? Was this a rescue, or was it a mission of vengeance, summoning a reserve of courage she didn't know she possessed? Lyra let go of Daisy's reins. She took a deep breath, the cool night air feeling like ice in her lungs, and she did the one thing they wouldn't expect. She walked away from the safety of her horse and her cabin and stepped out onto the porch. She stood there, a lone woman, in a faded cotton dress, unarmed, her hands hanging loosely at her sides. She would not cower. This was her home. She had taken in one of their children, not out of malice, but out of mercy. If she was to die here on the porch Angus had built, she would die looking her executioner in the eye. The chief reined in his pinto about 50 feet from her porch. He stared at her, his expression unreadable, his silence a crushing weight. Several other warriors, likely his lieutenants, moved up to flank him. The tension stretched taut, thin, and fragile as a spider's thread. One wrong move, one shout, one panicked gesture, and it would snap. Finally, the chief spoke. His voice was deep, resonant, and carried easily across the distance. He spoke in the Cheyenne tongue, the words guttural and sharp. Lyra didn't understand a single one, but the meaning was as clear as a gunshot. It was a demand, an accusation. One of the warriors beside him, an older man with a face like a dried apple, urged his horse forward a few paces and spoke in broken, heavily accented English. "He asks," the warrior said, his voice raspy, "where is the boy? He is Stoneheart. The boy is his son. You have taken the son of the chief." Lyra's world tilted on its axis. The lost child, the boy she had pulled from the Coyotes, was not just any boy. He was the son of the formidable warrior who now held her life and the lives of her neighbors in his hands. The stakes, already impossibly high, had just skyrocketed into the heavens. She swallowed hard, her throat dry as dust. She looked at the impassive face of Stoneheart, then at the 120 warriors, waiting for his command. She had no boy to give him, and she had no way to explain what had happened. The warrior's words hung in the air, heavy and damning. "You have taken the son of the chief." Lyra's mind reeled. It explained the size of the war party, the grim determination on their faces. This wasn't just about a lost child. It was about the stolen heir of a powerful leader, a profound insult that could only be answered with blood. She had to answer. Silence would be an admission of guilt. I did not take him," she said, her voice trembling but clear. She directed her words to the older warrior, acting as an interpreter. "I found him. He was being attacked by coyotes." She pointed toward the dry creek bed, the spot where she had found him, though it was now lost in the deep twilight. "I saved him. I brought him here. I cleaned his wounds." The interpreter relayed her words to Stoneheart. The chief's granite expression did not change. He listened, then spoke another short, sharp phrase. "He says the boy would not be here if you did not take him," the interpreter translated. "He says white settlers steal land, they steal buffalo, and they steal children. He says you lie." A wave of despair washed over Lyra. How could she prove it? Her word against their suspicion. It was hopeless. The warriors were beginning to shift restlessly, their ponies sensing the rising tension. The low murmur of their voices was like the growl of a predator. "I am not lying," she insisted, her voice rising with desperation. "His leg was injured. I bandaged it. He had a fever. I gave him medicine." She looked around frantically, as if the proof might just be lying on the porch. "He was here on a cot inside, but he got scared. He broke a window and he ran away while I was gone." The interpreter translated again. Stoneheart listened, then his gaze swept over her cabin, settling on the dark square of the broken window. For the first time, a flicker of something uncertainty, perhaps, crossed his features. He barked an order. 2 warriors dismounted and, with rifles held ready, cautiously approached the cabin. Lyra's heart hammered. She stood perfectly still, knowing any sudden movement could be misinterpreted. The warriors peered through the broken window. Then one of them pushed open the door, and they disappeared inside. The wait was an eternity. The silence of the plains returned thick with menace. Lyra could feel the hatred of 120 men focused on her like the heat from a furnace. They saw her as the embodiment of all the wrongs done to their people. After a minute that felt like a lifetime, the two warriors emerged from the cabin. One of them was holding something up. It was the bowl of stew she had left out, now cold and congealed. The other held the small empty bottle that had contained the quinine from Sheriff Brody. He spoke rapidly to Stoneheart. The chief's gaze shifted from the bottle back to Lyra. He barked a question. "He asks why a captor would give medicine," the interpreter said, a note of confusion in his own voice. "Because I am not a captor," Lyra cried. "I am a mother. I was trying to help him." Just as the words left her mouth, a commotion broke out at the edge of the war party near the northern hills. A few warriors turned shouting. A path opened in the line of horsemen, and two riders came through a small figure held between them. It was the boy. He was alive. A wave of relief so powerful it made her knees weak washed over Lyra. They had found him. The boy whose name she now knew was Noka, White Bear Cub. As she would later learn, was disheveled, and his face was pale, but he was unharmed. One of the warriors lifted him from the horse and set him on the ground before his father. Stoneheart dismounted in one fluid motion and knelt before his son. He put his hands on the boy's shoulders, his stern face softening with a fierce, profound relief that needed no translation. He spoke to his son in low, urgent Cheyenne. Noka, no longer the terrified child from the creek bed, but the son of a chief, answered him. He spoke quickly, his small hands gesturing. He pointed back toward the creek. He pointed to his own bandaged leg. Then he did something that changed everything. He turned and his eyes found Lyra, standing on the porch. He pointed a small, steady finger directly at her. The warriors tensed. Lances were raised slightly. This was it, the moment of judgment. But Noka wasn't pointing an accusation. He spoke again, his child's voice carrying clearly in the stillness. Then he limped forward a few steps toward the cabin and pointed at the ground just off the porch where the bodies of the two coyotes she had killed still lay untouched in the growing darkness. The old interpreter's eyes widened. He listened to the boy, then turned to Lyra. His expression transformed from suspicion to astonishment. "The boy, Noka, he tells his father." The interpreter began stumbling over the English words. "He says he was lost. He followed a rabbit into the tall grass. He says the dog soldiers," he gestured to the dead coyotes, "came for him. They bit him. He says you came from the sun, with a thunder stick. He says you fought them. You saved him." A murmur rippled through the war party. Faces that had been masks of hate now showed confusion, doubt. Stoneheart stood up. His gaze locked on Lyra. He saw her not as a liar or a thief, but as the strange woman from his son's story, the savior who came from the sun. But a crucial question remained. Stoneheart spoke again, his voice softer now but still laced with the authority of a leader who needed all the facts. The interpreter turned to her. "The chief understands you saved him. Now he asks why. Why would a white woman save a Cheyenne boy? It was the most important question of all." And Lyra found she had no easy answer. How could she explain the hollow ache for her own lost son? How could she describe the maternal instinct that had overridden all fear and reason? Words were inadequate, so she used the one thing she had left. Her hand went to the collar of her dress, to the thin silver chain she always wore. She pulled it out. At the end of it was a small, oval-shaped silver locket, tarnished with age. It was her most precious possession. With trembling fingers, she opened it. She stepped down from the porch and walked slowly across the dusty ground, stopping a few feet from the formidable chief. The warriors watched her every move, but no one tried to stop her. She held out the open locket. Stoneheart looked down. Inside were two tiny, faded tin-type portraits. On one side was a younger Lyra, her face softer smiling. On the other side was a small boy, with serious eyes and a mop of light brown hair. Her son Thomas. She didn't need the interpreter. She looked from the picture of Thomas to Noka, who now stood beside his father, and then met Stoneheart's gaze. She touched her chest over her heart. "My son," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "He is gone. To the sky." She pointed upward. Then she looked at Noka. "Your son." The chasm between them of race, of language, of a history, written in blood and betrayal, vanished in that single shared instant. Stoneheart was not just a war chief. He was a father who had almost lost his child. Lyra was not just a white settler. She was a mother who had already lost hers. In her eyes, he saw not an enemy, but the reflection of his own love, his own fear, his own relief. He saw her humanity. He reached out, and with a surprisingly gentle finger, he lightly touched the edge of the locket. He looked at the picture of Thomas for a long moment, then back at Lyra. He gave a slow, solemn nod. He understood. He straightened up and spoke to his men. His tone was no longer harsh and demanding. It was calm, decisive. The war party as one relaxed. Lances were lowered. Rifles were slung back over shoulders. The immediate threat had evaporated like a morning mist. Stoneheart turned back to his son and placed a hand on his head. Then he looked at Lyra, and for the first time she saw something other than suspicion or authority in his eyes. It was respect. He gave a sharp command. One of his warriors dismounted, untied a magnificent, richly painted buffalo robe from his saddle, and laid it at Lyra's feet. It was a gift of immense honor. Stoneheart spoke a final word to the interpreter. He says, "The debt is paid." The old man translated his voice, filled with awe. He says the name of Lyra McCloud will be spoken with honor in the lodges of the Cheyenne. He says you are a woman of great courage, a mother's heart. Without another word, Stoneheart swung himself onto his pinto. He gathered his son up before him. He gave Lyra one last long look, then turned his horse and led his warriors away. They melted back over the northern ridge as silently as they had come, the thunder of their hooves fading until only the whisper of the wind remained. Lyra stood alone in the darkness, the precious buffalo robe at her feet, the silver locket still clutched in her hand. The storm had come, and it had broken, and in its wake it had left not destruction, but a strange, profound, and impossible peace. The story of Lyra McCloud and the son of Stoneheart wasn't written in any official history books. It wasn't a battle that changed the course of a war, but it was a moment that changed the course of human hearts. In the vast, lonely expanse of the American West, a widowed farmer's wife proved that the fiercest courage isn't found in the barrel of a gun, but in the boundless depths of compassion. She faced down a war party, not with defiance, but with the shared truth of a mother's love, a language that needs no translation. Her story reminds us that even in the most divided of times, our common humanity can build a bridge across any chasm. What would you have done in her place? Let us know in the comments below. If this story of frontier grit and unexpected grace moved you, please honor Lyra's memory by hitting that like button, share it with someone who loves a powerful true story, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales from the heart of the American West. Thank you for listening.